So warm welcome, everybody. We're actually already starting because we don't want to eat up too much time of this interesting discussion that we will have today. While the others on board, we have quite a lot of registrations today and give the colleagues the opportunity to just join us a bit later. So hello, everybody. We are here today to listen to Marta Cantero Gamito's latest article, latest paper. Marta is a professor of IT law at the University of Tartu and since 22 also a research fellow at the STG at the UI here in Florence. Marta has held positions at the LSE, Helsinki University, University of Oxford, the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg, and Harvard Law School. So a very international scholar and profile, and that also reflects in her focus and research at the SDG. She's also engaged in executive trainings on algorithmic fairness, and all of that dates back to her PhD with Hans Miklitz, which is very nice because Hans is very an interesting personality, and having been mentored by him, I assume, was a really particularly enriching experience of your academic life. So you, Marta, wrote your PhD at the UI in law on private law dimension of the EU regulatory framework for electronic communication. And in terms of foresight, that was actually at the time when you finished the PhD. So you started in 11 and finished in 15. That was a bit before the entire wave of academic interest in all of these technologies and innovation policy and regulation frameworks. So your expertise is really spans, although it's in terms of biological age, would not reflect, spans a really biographic understanding of the development of a policy area and legal issues around regulation of technology and innovation as we know it. You just in February 26 finished a research project in which you were PI on promoting fairness of the music ecosystem in a platform-dominated and post-pandemic Europe. And your publications focus on AI governance and regulation within the EU, but also more broadly on non-discrimination, on aspects of values and fairness, AI co-regulation, so private-public co-regulation, and the regulation of online platforms in general. Today, you will be talking about a paper that you recently finished on harmonizing consensus, the geopolitical economy of standardization in the EU's AI Act. And while the paper is already finished today, as an outcome of the presentation on a more broader research agenda of Marta on the authority and normativity of private actors in the regulation of technology and governance of technology. Marta wants us to focus a bit on potential institutional responses to the diagnosis that she presents in the paper. So focusing really on a policy relevant perspective here and on plausible, maybe also potential versus plausible. So exploring the wealth of potential institutional responses. With that, Marta, over to you, our usual format, 45 minutes presentation, and then we discuss. And you're all invited to scribble potential institutional responses that come to mind and your feedback so that we can engage in a rich Q&A and discussion after Marta's presentation. Marta, over to you. And thank you for joining us. A great pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, Gabby, for first the very kind presentation and very comprehensive presentation of my trajectory so far, and of course for accepting my proposal to discuss the paper in this group, because I think it's a group where I can actually benefit from a lot of insight, as you rightly pointed out, in terms of like what are the institutional responses to some of the issues that I'm putting on the table with this paper. Thank you also, to Mira for making it possible, and thank you for everyone who joined to hear about my paper today. Very glad, as I just said, about presenting this paper today. I'm going to share a few slides that I have prepared. If I get it right, you should be already seeing my screen. Okay, great. Thank you, Rafael, for confirming. So the name of my paper is Harmonizing Consensus, the Geopolitical Economy of Standardization in the AI Act. So essentially, what this paper is about, I mean, is made available at SSRN. It's a draft paper so far. It's going to be part of a collection of papers in a special issue at GPTech, in which basically like all revolve around the standardization in the digital age. And then my area of focus was particularly this aspect of standardization within the AI Act and how it affects like the current geopolitical landscape and vice versa. So essentially, the paper that I'm presenting is driven by the following question. So I am interested in knowing whether the EU can effectively kind of project normative values for AI governance or its understanding of AI governance through technical standardization. So that's kind of like my area of focus. But the reason why I got interested in this question comes from a kind of like a personal research story. So back in 2016, 10 years ago now, time flies, I was in Geneva interviewing people at the International Telecommunications Union. So I kind of observed that it's not a fora, even though it was in Switzerland, where you will see many what could say, and forgive me for this oversimplification, like many Western faces. And seeing this particular setting, I started wondering, okay, like I was at that time getting familiar with what the standardization was about. I was working on standardizations from the year before that during my postdoc, and I was interested in knowing where where the forces who were shaping standards internationally. So I started to become more and more curious, and after an intense time during doing basically just telecommunications in 2018, I remember I was sitting in Badia's library finalizing a different book, and I was thinking about like, okay, how all this has to do with AI, which at 2018, bear with me that at that time, like we were all like mesmerized by what's going on in terms of AI, because before that, there were some discussions, but lawyers, we were not yet super much into the topic. So when we started to get into the topic, we saw like, okay, what is this about? How is this going to change the law? How are we going to regulate this? And then, since I just came from a period, intense period working on standardization, then I realized like, I bet the standards have a lot to do with this. And I started digging a bit with some contacts that I had. And indeed, there was a lot of work going on in AI standardization, particularly in the ITU, like International Telecommunications Union, even though it was like an an agency, because it's a new agency that has a different remit. Like the remit that the ITU has is precisely to look into telecommunication standards and to facilitate interoperability, etc., with its own political struggles that I won't go into because it's a different kind of like story. But that kind of that started like getting into the remit of being more like digital slash AI kind of agency, standard setting agency. However, then I thought like, okay, but this there is something that is missing in this story, because if the official remit of the ITU is not to write AI standards, why there are so many subgroups working on AI standards? And then I started looking into who was the Secretary General at that time of the organization, and it was somebody coming from China. And then slowly, I started looking into what are the different groups that are forming these committees. Where are they coming from? Because all this is public information. You can just retrieve the information on who kind of like forms the different committees. And then I started seeing like a lot of influence from China. And then I started looking at the literature around 2019 about like, okay, what is going on here? And then indeed I saw that there is like a lot of interest from part of political science scholarship looking into how China is kind of like taking a stance in international standardization as a way to export their values. And at that time, I was coming from a moment in which these 3 years prior to that were focused particularly in how the EU was using standardization fora to project normative values elsewhere. So at that time, 2015, the Brussels paper, the Brussels effect was just a paper from 2012, and that was what we used during my postdoc to look into how the EU was projecting its normative ambitions, not only through extraterritoriality, which it did very effectively with the GDPR, but particularly through private law instruments. And I was in charge of looking into technical standards and telecommunications. That's what I was looking into that. So what happened is that seeing that there was a lot of traction at that time of both extraterritoriality of EU rules, but also international standards coming from the EU, then that allowed us to see what was precisely the broader normative project that the EU had in mind. And when I started looking into what was going on in relation to AI standardization, and then I saw China, then we could actually anticipate that there will be like a clash and that things will not turn towards global harmonization, but instead we will turn towards what we have now, which are like different kind of like understandings of the technology, how to integrate the technology into society, and how to regulate the technology. So with that in mind, then my agenda for the last 7, 8 years have been who and how is governing. First, I was interested in telecoms, then the digital space, and now more specifically AI. So that's how I got to this question. I wanted to know how the EU is projecting its vision for AI governance outside the EU and how it's doing that, not only with the AI Act, but with what comes under it. There is a lot of reliance on standardization, and there is a lot of projection that those standards can have outside the EU, or at least so was the expectation. And I wanted to unpack through different papers what's going on. So the paper I'm presenting today is like, okay, is there divergence between those standards that are produced internationally and those which are produced within the EU, or is it more convergence? So taking as a starting point the Brussels effect, let's assume that then what we are testing is whether the Brussels effect still holds true for what is going on internationally, right? The point is that with the current institutional, procedural, and even substantive configuration of the AI Act, a lot of commentators, including myself, we could already anticipate that the AI Act will not replicate what happened already with the GDPR. So after having looked into different aspects of standardization in the AI Act, legitimacy, co-regulation, the role of the ETSI, so more like kind of like specific aspects, I wanted to zoom out a bit and look at the broader picture. Okay, how is it going to affect externally the impact of the AI Act, but also how the current standardization dynamics may impact internally how the AI Act is going to work in the internal market. So with that in mind, I started to look into the different kind of issues, but I want to focus first on this is like a bit like on the opposite direction. Okay, so there we go. So I wanted to look into what are the manifestations of potential Brussels effect outside the EU tested against what was actually going on in relation to it. So the starting hypothesis is like, and this I will explain in a second, there is a strong or important delegation of how to define what are the key obligations under the AI Act for high-risk AI systems, and that those have been delegated to harmonized standards. These harmonized standards even though it's like a legal term, is defined in EU legislation, etc., are developed by private transnational bodies because the European standardization organizations, which are three, Sense and Elect and EXI, even though they help the EU legislator to specify the technical requirements to comply with a specific legal obligation or broader legal obligation, they are private companies. So that's important to take into consideration. A second issue to take into consideration is that standards are not neutral because they define specific questions that are now more than at least before normative in nature, and they're like kind of value laden choices to be made inside those fora. So those become a matter of political debate, and in the current geopolitical scenario, they become also like a matter of geopolitical contestation. And this was my starting hypothesis based on what I have just seen in my previous research in relation to the role of China in the ITU, the role of the ETSI, etc. So I was starting also from that hypothesis. So based on that, I'm anticipating what is the main claim of my paper, and I claim that there is a structural gap between what is the ambition of the EU in regulatory terms. So the EU is, and in particularly the AI Act, has been marketized as the first AI regulation that will have an impact globally, etc., and the realities of international standardization that will have an impact on that regulatory ambition. So those are kind of like both the starting hypothesis, where my paper is coming from, and anticipating a bit what is the result. So now I need to explain a bit why standardization is important in the field of AI, and in particular, like what are the characteristics of AI related standardization. So as a first point, it is important, this is a clarification, so it's important to clarify that AI is subject to both horizontal and vertical standardization. So you can horizontally, for instance, define risk management standards or data quality standards or explainability. So this will be concretizing some of the regulatory obligations that are already contained in the AI Act. I will explain what the legal functioning is later for those who are not familiar with how standards work in the EU law or EU legal ecosystem. But essentially, if you are standardizing a technology, you can standardize like on matters that are horizontal, as I just mentioned, but also matters that are vertical. So for instance, whether you are talking about AI in the healthcare, or whether you are using or talking about AI standards for financial scoring or for autonomous vehicles, etc. So we have here like an important component that is not only that we can see at horizontal level, but that it also cuts across like different sectors, which I will not touch upon because it's a matter of like comprising the ideas that I want to develop here. But then secondly, I want to talk about a bit the function of standards, and in particular of those standards that are related to AI. So the first function is about interoperability and technical feasibility. So essentially here, when we talk about standards in general, not only in relation to AI, standards essentially just enable the systems work together. So whether if it is about data formats, whether if it is about like an API, whether it is like about like how my phone connects to 5G, etc. So all those are standards, and they just like by facilitating interoperability, they enable international trade. Then the second function of standards are kind of like serve as a parameter for market regulation. So as we will see in a second, like standards can presume conformity with the legal or the broader legal requirements contained in the legislation, and complying with those standards from a market regulation perspective means legal conformity with the applicable rules. So that means that following the technical steps set out by standards kind of ensure participating in a certain market in a legal manner. But then more and more standards are issues or tools that have an increase in geostrategic relevance because they can determine who enters which market, right? and under what conditions. So that means that taking that into account, whomever sets the standards to some extent may get the upper hand forwards or towards their domestic market. And more so in the case of AI related standardization, standards also like set at an ethical baseline. So they are translating into technical parameters, very kind of like normative concepts such as fairness, bias, transparency, terms that in themselves, even when contained in the legislation, are not self-executing or self-enforced, but they require of that technical translation to be made in the technical standard. Connected to this, the third point that I want to make in relation to AI-related standardization is what is a conceptual substantial limit of a standard. And here what I want to touch upon is the fact that there is a situation in which we are seeing more than before that when it comes to AI-related standardization, more than just simply specifying, AI-related standards are about defining foundational values, and that includes also defining concepts. So there is an ISO standard 22989 that it's about key concepts on AI governance. And among these key concepts, like it defines fairness, bias, etc. Again, this is not done in a setting that one could expect that given the nature of the concept to be discussed is of a political nature, but it's like a committee, rather technocratic, if one may say so. So one thing that also caught my attention, like I bought the standard the other day. So one issue for those of you who are not familiar with the standardization is that standardization deliverables, since they are coming from private companies and they're like a product, they are sold, right? So if you want to access a standard, you need to buy it. This particular one that I just mentioned is for free. So you can download it for free on the ISO website. Like you need to go through the process of buying the standard, but you don't have to pay. You don't have to pay for it. There is a lot of case law now in relation to the accessibility of private standards at the moment, like a ruling that came a few days ago. And probably we can talk about that separately. But in this particular case, I wanted to look at this standard and it was for free. So I look at it. And one thing that caught my attention is that it includes a definition of AGI, like artificial general intelligence. And it really caught my attention because even at the level of the AI Act, the legislator like had a hard time finding like a common ground for defining AI. AGI is not defined in the AI Act. It is defined in this more technical document. And one thing that calls my attention is that I'm now interested again, like as Gabby when introducing me mentioned, like I'm interested in private regulation, how private regulation, private regulators regulate technology. One thing that keeps my heart beating at the moment is like coming up with a bigger theory of how this is happening, like bottom up. And one example that I find particularly fascinating is the financing agreement between Microsoft and OpenAI that will kind of get to maturation once OpenAI finds AGI. And that means that the definition of what constitutes AGI is not contained in a piece of legislation, but in a private contract. It's a definition that is basically of economic nature, financial nature. But I find it fascinating that depending on who is talking, then we have different definitions of AGI, and it's going to be like a constitutive technology. So at least one should expect some consensus. Again, bring it back to the point that I want to make on the paper, right? So this is something that when we talk about standardization, most of the conceptual leverage is not coming from the legislation, from these technical private documents that we tend to overlook unless you're working on compliance. So those are kind of like some of the issues that I want to put on the table now. So why do standard matters? Like now to put it like on a more practical lenses. So standards bridge the gap between abstraction and operational requirements. So hear me out here. The AI Act has a specific regulatory obligations for AI high-risk systems, and those regulatory obligations can be operationalized through standards. You can also operationalize them yourself if you're an AI developing company, and then you want to come up with your own criteria of how you think you will self-fulfill those requirements. But since there is like this official delegation to standards to provide those technical details, it is always safer and cheaper to actually just follow what the technical document is telling you. Also legally a more safer option. Then another issue, what I want to bring the attention to is because of the many reasons I just mentioned, there is a growing significance in international standardization. So that means that participating in international standard developing organizations, which is what SDO stands for, is actually now like a way to show international presence. And that's why, as I was explaining at the beginning of this presentation, China had this interest in participating in the ITU and populating the committees, etc., etc. And a third point that I want to mention here, why in AI we should pay attention to standardization, and this is something that thankfully has been talked a lot over the last few years, is that there is a normative incompatibility between the private interests of those who shape the standards and the public interest in which we understand that regulation kind of should, or the angle or the perspective that regulation we expect it should be having. So as I mentioned before, through this I will go quickly, but for those of you who are not familiar with the way in which standards work within EU law, there is this compulsory kind of like mini session I need to make. And under the AI Act, we have like a system that follows like a risk-based approach. And depending on the type of risk, then the system will be subject to a set of obligations or others. So we focus on high-risk AI systems because this is kind of like the bulk of the AI Act. So most of the regulatory obligations are contained in the AI Act, aside from transparency, relate to high-risk AI systems because those who fall under the category of unacceptable risk will not be able to be marketed in the EU single market. So it doesn't really matter whether they comply with certain requirements or not because they are not possible to be on the market. So for high-risk systems, then there are like specific regulatory obligations concerning human oversight or risk management, accuracy, the data, etc., that contain like very broad categorizations of how the legislator understand that those regulatory obligations need to be or need to look like. But then what it does, so for instance, here I have an example from Article 15. It says like a high-risk AI system that continue to learn after being placed on the market or put into service shall be developed in such a way as to eliminate or reduce as far as possible the risk of possible biased outputs. So here we need to understand that it is very difficult for any company to actually self-assess what will constitute bias output or not, right? So taking that into consideration, the definition of how to technically comply with what will be a non-biased output is left to the standard. And here, a second step in explaining how a standard works under the AI Act. Under the AI Act, we have what is known as the presumption of conformity that stems from what it is known in EU law as a new legislative framework, which is what NLF stands for here. So under the new legislative framework, what we have is like an example that is very clear in the AI Act. You have like broader regulatory obligations, also known as essential requirements contained in the legislation, and that the technical specification of how to comply with those broader requirements is contained in a technical document that is a standard. If that standard is developed by one of the European standardization organizations under a request from the European Commission, that standard becomes a harmonized standard. And a harmonized standard under EU law enjoys a presumption of conformity. How does this look like in the AI Act? So in the AI Act, the high-risk AI systems or GPI models which are in conformity with harmonized standards shall be presumed in conformity. Okay, so again, harmonized standards are the only ones that are presuming conformity. That means that if your AI system complies with the requirements of a harmonized standards, we already assume that it complies with the AI Act, as simple as that. What are the reasons? So the new legislative framework is a framework that stems back already from the 80s. Okay, so it's already in the 80s was like it was matter of trying to make commercially, technically, and legally feasible the construction and the operation of the EU internal market. How? Establishing specific requirements, technical requirements that all products in that case, because we were talking at that time of free movement of goods, should satisfy it for those products to freely travel within the internal market. So taking that framing into account, there are specific advantages why the new legislative framework was adopted, because essentially what it brought about was mutual recognition. If a product or a service under certain circumstances within the EU complies with the technical standards, it means that it can be kind of like sold in any other member state. But there are strategic reasons beyond like kind of like simple commercial convenience that are more in line of explaining why the EU legislator opted for the NLF in the case of artificial intelligence regulation. So the first one is flexibility. So standards usually can be updated without reopening legislation, which is usually like a slower kind of procedure. And that means that in that case, we should consider how the pace at which technology evolves and everything like means that the regulation can still contain those essential requirements, and the more technical details will be done like in standardization, which is seemingly because we have also like some problems at the moment with the standardization, is seemingly faster. Then it's also a matter of industrial policy, because of course, like if you leave, I mean, delegating to standardization essentially also means delegating to the private actors who are developing the technology. So that means that there is technical input coming from the industry itself. So it's also like standards become like a matter of industrial policy, because it kind of shields the European industry by letting them define what are the specific technical requirements to which they would be actually subject to. And this is not only a matter of kind of like epistemic capture, that can also be to some extent an industry capture, co-opting legislation, etc. But in this world in which we live, in this dichotomy between innovation, regulation, co-regulation always stands as a kind of like middle ground that can try to reconcile both aspirations. But importantly, and this goes back already to Majone, that noted already 30 years ago that when EU lawmaking delegates to technocratic bodies, that can also be used to reduce democratic contestation in a way that, for instance, the normative decisions that are to be made inside those committees can be reframed as technical ones. So here again, it is very difficult to find consensus within EU member states about what is like a fair, trustworthy AI system, and the way it can be done is like translated into technical detail. And finally, the normative projection of a standard is stronger than regulatory projection. And this is due to the fact that a rule reaches where the jurisdiction reaches, right? So like the AI Act can reach inside the EU, can apply extraterritoriality to some extent, but when there is a different rule elsewhere, then the AI Act is going to face a wall. In this case, if we talk about standardizations, since the standards are kind of like voluntary, there is a lot of precision to be made there, but like in essence, they're voluntary tools. Then of course, like it is easier through market tools to actually just push EU values through the standards than it is through legislation, because there is less friction, there is less contestation about it. So one aspect that I want to mention is that the practical implementation of the AI Act elsewhere, so outside the EU, and how that's translated into technical standard specifications, not only in European standardization, but also in international standardization. It's an issue that is unavoidable rather than optional, because now the EU is playing with what is going on in international standardization, not only within the EU, but also what is going on like in international setup. And the EU legislator is aware of this. And that kind of like situates the development of harmonized standards for complying with the AI Act in a position of kind of structural dependence, because then when there is no capacity inside European standardization organizations to develop sound standards, or where already there is a development that is taking place elsewhere, because again, like this is like a matter of like who has developed the standard first in some instances. So then that structural dependence is reflected in the dynamics that European standardization is going to take from there on. So how has the European legislator has sorted that? So I call this conditional openness to international standardization, because Article 14, paragraph 3 actually talks about like it is possible to take into account international standards, and it is actually quite helpful because again, the EU doesn't live in its own term. The EU doesn't live in autarky. The EU needs the technology also from abroad. In the same way that the EU needs the technology from abroad, it also needs the standards from abroad. And that means that when there are very international standards, those need to be taken into consideration, because otherwise you will be kind of like contravening WTO rules and the TBT agreement to some extent, for those of you who are familiar with international trade law. So it is important that the EU legislator is acknowledging that international standards where they exist, they need to be taken into consideration, but is doing so, as I already mentioned, under a condition. And that the condition is that those standards are consistent with the union values, fundamental rights, and interests of the EU. And here is where things kind of start decoupling from what is going on in international standardization, because the EU is saying, yes, I'm going to consider international standards as far as it aligns with my interests. So it's a kind of like selective alignment, what the EU is doing here. This can also be seen, this is part of the standardization request to the European standardization organizations made by the Commission, and mandates a work program in which they need to indicate what are the standardization deliverables, but they should be taking into consideration that European standards and European standardizations are in conformity with union law on fundamental rights and union data protection laws. So this is another assertion from the European, in this case, the Commission, from the European executive, to actually say like, okay, we are going to grant you or delegating to you the possibility of setting setting harmonized standards, as long as these are not compatible with the EU kind of way of life, as it is usually also referred to. There is a fallback mechanism, which is Article 41, Common Specifications. I forgot to put it on the slides, which is about giving back to the European Commission the possibility of being the Commission itself, the one who decides what are going to be the technical specifications where technical or harmonized standards fall short or do not respect sufficiently EU fundamental rights. So that means that in those instances, it's going to be the Commission itself, the one who is going to put forward the technical specifications that will amount at conformity with the essential requirements contained in the AI Act. That's a fallback mechanism, again, to retain that there are no harmonized standards that will contravene the EU values and the EU fundamental rights, etc. So what did I do next? So help me out here. I'm trying to kind of like summarize very briefly some of the things that I tried to do with the paper when looking into this option. And here come an answer to possible methodological questions that may come up at this stage. Why did you look at these jurisdictions? How did you select the issues, etc., etc.? So I look at this jurisdiction as essentially just like as ABC kind of choice, like everybody does. Like we look into the EU, the US, and China as being like different approaches and being the dominant approaches, and how each of them is like going about this. So I didn't like make like a specific motivated decision in my methodological design to do this. And kind of like was being guided from everything I was following on in my work elsewhere. So essentially, and this is like a kind of like oversimplification. I mean, oversimplification. So don't take this as for granted. In the paper, there is a more detail into this. But essentially, I'm comparing like the US, the China, and the EU model because the US is a more bottom-up industry level model, whereas it contrasts very well with the China, which is more state-guided type of model, etc. And in the midway comes the EU, which is like a semi-public, semi-private delegation to Sense and Elect and EXI, which are private organizations, but are regulated under standardization regulation from 2012, and therefore like kind of like mimic certain, let's say, democratic procedures that you will expect from important norm making, to not use the word lawmaking. So in terms of goals, the US is more about like asserting market dominance, whereas China is more about like projecting technopolitical sovereignty, with the caveats that that term may entail that we are not going to enter upon. Whereas the EU has this more like normative diffusion ambition, like this idea of like projecting EU values outside of the EU internal market. So in the US, participation driven by that goal is more like corporate dominated, whereas in China is of course like state control, and in the EU is like a mix between pseudo formal neutrality, but to some extent corporate influence is embedded there. Like if back in the day when I was doing research on standardization, I was talking to somebody from Nokia who participates usually in standardization. And of course, he did not only represent Nokia, but also represented Finland. So it kind of like shows this dual role that people working in standardization play in, especially in EU companies. So what did I do? So what did I do? Very briefly, you have more information in the paper. And then again, another methodological justification I'm making here is that I picked and choose different standards or the work on standards on different areas that have this normative component in which we might anticipate that convergence towards those will not always be that take it for granted, so to say, and where we respect some normative debate or some of some level, and that as a result we will respect some divergence in the different national slash regional kind of progresses that would explain that, or that would not explain, but that would illustrate rather that we cannot expect global convergence in highly normative issues. So that's kind of like the point I was trying to look into here. Of course, always looking through the lenses of an European who is interested in seeing how this will translate in AI Act terminology. So that's kind of what drove my analysis in here. So with regard to facial recognition, I look into the IEEE P 7000 series standard, and in particular 7001, which is like not explicitly on facial recognition, but kind of like has certain issues regarding biometrical identification, etc., that will justify like to make a comparison to how it would look like elsewhere, for instance, in relation to Article 5 of the AI Act that actually prohibits remote biometric identification. And here, what we see is that there are different understandings. So IEEE standard is more based on like consent, human agency, etc. Whereas in China, it's more about like, no, the prioritary goal here is social stability, security, and therefore surveillance is like a broader goal to perceive or to pursue over individual agency, right? So here we find some friction. In explainability, we also find some friction. So the EU, when talks about explainability, we're not talking here about like how to operationalize explainability because a lot of legal scholarship has been very critical about how to operationalize explainability. But the political and legal aim of the EU is actually to frame explainability as a right-based requirement. So, kind of like by framing explainability as a right in itself, we now see that it cannot be part of a voluntary exercise that should be translated, such as, for instance, in the US, the NIST, one of the NIST standards dealing with explainability treats it more as part of like a voluntary risk management scheme. And then in China, it's more about controllability. So in the Special Committee 42, which is the special committee inside the ISO is like the International Standardization Organization, and together with IEC or IEC, has set up a specific special committee for AI-related standards. So they kind of like are discussing on these issues. The standard I mentioned before on defining AGI is coming from that special committee. And here, one important issue with regard to explainability is that there is no consensus between interpretability and user comprehension. So there are those who see explainability as something that needs to yield interpretability, but not necessarily that the user comprehends what the system is doing. Whether there are those who more materialistic terms, they want to understand explainability as something that help the individual for something. This will be more in line on what the EU has in mind because it sees it as a rights base. But at the same time, if it stands on the surface of just transparency, it might not help us for anything. There is a lot of literature discussing into that. Then similarly, in risk management, we also find divergence. So in the case of the EU, if you look at Article 9, what we see is like it's a more kind of like life cycle based mandatory system to keep in mind risk management, also because the AI Act in itself is like risk based. And then in the case of the US, it's more like voluntary, and then China, it's more like about like compliant with certain risk management for some sort of like international face washing. They don't care substantially that much, or so is what the literature on this specific issue regarding Chinese standards on risk management tells us about it. And of course, when we talk about, for instance, international initiatives or international standards on risk management coming from ISO that has a long trajectory on establishing risk management standards in certain specific contexts is more about organizational risks and procedures rather than link it to more substantial protection of fundamental rights. And finally, with regards to bias and fairness, the EU sees this as a kind of like legal obligation that is about enforcing the rights. So here is not as a tool, as we saw explainability towards like achieving or preserving human dignity or preserving human fundamental rights, etc. But it's more like as something that the EU is seeing as a goal in itself. So only when an AI system is fair, only when an AI system is non-biased, then we can see that the right that can be derived from the regulatory obligations, because once again, for those of you who are not familiar with the AI Act, is not a charter of rights. It is simply a set of specific, broad regulatory obligations that need to, as I said already for quite a few sometimes, to me to be made operationalized by technical standards, but it is not a charter of rights. However, if we look into the regulatory obligations, one can infer certain rights, and bias and fairness, or non-bias or neutral AI and fair AI is kind of like the broader objective that the EU is aiming at. Whereas in the case of bias and fairness, China is treating those as something that it has more to do with accuracy rather than with something that is a right-based goal in itself. So when it comes to defining fairness in international standardization setups, then the discussions usually get stalled because, again, similarly to explainability, there are diverging views about what are the purposes and limits of algorithmic governance, and therefore, like what can be considered biased, what should not be considered biased, etc., etc. So again, so these are things that are like a bit like explained more in detail in my paper, and it refers to a lot of literature who has like focus in particularly in those issues, because again, like this will require like a project in its own, like a project in which we will look into the different aspects and try to look into what are the divergences, etc. Whether this is more like a kind of like testing ground, what I'm doing with this paper, and just like paving a bit the way for more research to follow if I find the time and of course the funding to do this research. So the main claim of my paper is that consensus is not convergence. And to explain this, I first need to explain why I'm paying attention to consensus here. To those of you who are familiar with standardization, consensus is the key. So standardization is consensus based usually. And finding a consensus is not always easy, especially in contexts where the committees are made out of engineers. There are no ethicists, there are no many lawyers. It's mostly engineers and economists, the ones who sit in international standardization. But the rule is like that of to find consensus. In issues that, as we just saw, are very normative, finding consensus is not a technical but a political exercise. So if we translate that into the ambition of the EU to translate those EU values towards the rest of the world, what we find is that consensus actually means that the EU needs to accept that its normative ambition there is going to get diluted. And it's going to get diluted because it is impossible to find consensus in international standardization fora when you have three very divergent main views. There are other views, but like you have very divergent views pulling a different direction. So that kind of like difficult consensus, and when some consensus is found, that means that a compromise has to be reached. And if you are standing for a better or bigger assertion of EU visions, then the result is that that ambition needs to be relaxed a bit. So there is also a risk in relation to the what I find to be excessive delegation to harmonized standards, even within the EU, because when we're talking about harmonized standards, we're talking about like standards developed within the EU. But because we are talking about talking again, operationalizing broad and more normative based regulatory obligations into technical detail that may just result into like a compliance exercise, so that might displace any kind of normative discussion inside companies and such, or more like appointing somebody who is in charge of ethics, etc., like a way, as long as then the procedure can be just more like be more automatic, so to say. We are also looking together with Hans Miklitz actually on how the AI Act itself, through Article 11, facilitates automatic enforcement, something that we believe is not what was in the mind of the EU legislator, but there is like a kind of like gap through which these things can get through. So what are the concrete risks for the AI Act and for the AI aspirations? That is what I'm concerned with in my research in this particular paper. So first, that when there are definitions that can be recycled from international standardization, so for instance, through the ICO, through ISO, as we saw, the legislation itself recognizes that there is a need to consider international standards. So when we bring in kind of like unclear definitions from outside, that would also result into uncertainty within EU law. That has not yet happened, but it is suspected that if you bring in certain definitions that are the result of consensus, that is going to be at odds with what the EU legislator has in mind, or so I anticipate. Then, when we talk about like operationalizing accountability as having an internal process, for instance, like a risk management process, rather than like an actual substantive system for assessing risk, then that undermines what is the actual intention of the legislator with regard to risk management, for instance. And then we also anticipate that in that process of everybody pulling in its own direction when trying to find consensus, the result is that, as I talked before, like the EU is establishing a mechanisms of conditional adoption of international standard. If the international standard does not meet the EU threshold, the EU is going to be forced to reject the standard and produce its own, right? And this is good because at least intra-EU would preserve the EU values, but extra-EU, then we're going to have like a regulatory decoupling there that is going to be very difficult to overcome without becoming isolated. So the challenge is to find kind of like a consensus that reflect in this kind of like pooling exercise to find a consensus that reflects both the high ambitions, particularly from the perspectives of the EU that the EU has in relation to this, rather than just trying to find the lowest common denominator. And this is a problem. The problem is that when we have divergent interest, the problem is that we might be looking into a race to the bottom. And that's not what it should be, because if anything, the EU, when it first came out with the first draft for the AI Act in 2021 and the high level group principles, etc., in 2018, it did so with this idea of like a race to the top, like who will set the highest standards, who will have the drive to actually bring in other jurisdiction more aligned with the EU, etc., 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 and that is now far from happening. So, what's the future? So, in the paper, I look at three potential scenarios that are the result of a question, and it's just realizing that there is this gap between the regulatory ambition of the EU and that infrastructural dependency, technical in terms of like the technology, but also like technical in terms of like participation in a standard setting organization, and procedural, like who is leading what. All that advancement towards dominating international standardization made by China a few years ago has now been counterbalanced by the EU, who has regained all positions of decision making inside international standardization fora. I believe I just said the EU, I meant the US. So the US has regained control over committees, over general secretariats, etc., inside the main international standardization fora, which means that given how the current geopolitical scenario looks like, and I guess we all know what it's looking like, and we don't have to go into detail, we are not at the best situation to negotiate with the US at the moment, especially because they are the ones exporting the technology. So that kind of like reinforces that infrastructural dependency. That leads to questions that in my head are and in my research are still unanswered about like what's going to happen in the future, or how is it going to look like in relation to harmonized standards. I have written about like internal discussions inside the European standardization organizations elsewhere. But for this paper, I came up with three scenarios because I was trying to test how the Brussels effect, in an oversimplification of what my argument is, which is not about the Brussels effect, but like how and whether the Brussels effect holds true given the procedural institutional configuration that the AI Act has made of standardization in this case. And I find three scenarios. The best case scenario is that the EU takes leverage in international standardization, and then all the international standards are shaped in line with the EU values, and then the EU becomes kind of like the benchmark leader, and that leads to some sort of global convergence. Unlikely. The middle case, which is more realistic, is that the EU selectively kind of decouples from different international standards that it does not consider in line with the EU values. In that case, set up its own technical standards that we just talked about, or common specifications, which are more political in nature. That doesn't mean more legitimate in any case. We haven't discussed that. We can discuss it in the Q&A. I'm concluding now. And that will bring internal coherence, but of course, global influence will be reduced. It seems like a more realistic scenario also because it doesn't seem that we are going towards any kind of globally harmonized AI governance in any instance. And in a personal stance, I don't even think that that's even desirable for the purposes of pluralism, etc. But of course, at least that minimum safety and understanding of what is trustworthy AI, safety, safe AI, etc., should be preserved. Odds are, given how situation stands at the moment, that beyond the EU is unlikely to happen. And then the worst case scenario is that the normative differences are so big that we end up with different regimes from different kind of like jurisdictions, and then like we will have to make like local adaptations in relation to that. So with that, I conclude. So in my paper, I kind of like claim that the AI Act reach is going to depend on who is authoring the standards, and that the approach taken by the EU legislator means like relying on structures that the EU does not control, at least not to a extent in which it can retain leverage over those. That the procedural consensus frequently conceals deep normative fractures. And here we already saw with the different case studies that I bring on the table, I think it shows that there are issues that are irreconcilable, but that procedural consensus can mask that there are underlying normative divergences, yet we come up with a standard that can be flawed, and we don't know how that's going to operate in the future. And then a point that we have not touched upon is legitimacy, that has been touched upon in legal scholarship and political science scholarship for at least 20, 30 years already. But the problem still remains. Civil society and small and medium enterprises are marginal in the standard setting, and that kind of like also tells a part of the story, or is rather is a part of a story that is not properly told, and is not sufficiently considered, in my opinion. And that all this gives rise to specific questions. I have more than those, but I just bringing in three specific questions: whether normatively dense obligations such as the ones we just saw should be delegated to standardization at all, whether common specifications, which is this fallback mechanism or backup mechanism, can be used as ordinary tools rather than exceptional fallbacks. And it is expected that common specification will play a huge role, because no matter how many delays, no matter how many omnibus, no matter how anything, the act sooner or later needs to enter into force. And so far, we don't have the mechanisms yet to operationalize that. And sooner than later, the European Commission is going to start issuing common specifications so that the implementation of the AI Act start to be rolled out. And finally, how to maintain regulatory adaptability or even some sort of regulatory interoperability when the EU needs to, by the reasons we just mentioned before, start decoupling from international standardization. So sorry I took over a few minutes. Thank you so much for getting with me up to here. I know it was a bit dense, but not knowing precisely the audience, I didn't want to leave anybody behind in how standardization works. Now, very much looking forward to hear your comments, questions, suggestions, and anything. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot, Marta, for the tour um, into an area that seems at first glance technical and legal, but is far from. While I talk you through my ideas that came up while you were presenting. I invite everyone to raise their hands for questions, and you will obviously, rather than me matronizing the floor, have precedence then in that case. But just some reflections from my side that came. When you talked us through the your presentation and the necessary legal background of the understanding, I was reminded very much by the function and role standards have in the AI Act of a heuristics that was taken on board in environmental policy and law whenever there was legislation on areas that were technologically demanding and in development, which are the best available techniques. And this recurse or reference to standards seems in the AI Act seems to be, to me, a bit having this function of a placeholder. We don't know what it is, but we don't want to design an outdated law, so we have this container that is future open. Chemical regulation, REACH often had this reference to best available techniques. These were, however, framed or fenced rather by the environmental principles. No harm, polluter pays. So there was a different layer of legal obligations of the individual actor when confronted with legislation in the environment. So here comes the thing, my reflection. So you said that standards are not neutral. And as every quantification, and there your work very much speaks to the body of sociology of quantification, says that numbers are never neutral. They are developed by somebody, they are used by somebody, and there are interests behind that, and priorities. And standardization, as you've excellently talked us through and showed us, are having in different geopolitical spheres, the US, China, and the EU, different logics. How they are created, by whom, for what they are created. So the functionality, the goals also. And there, something comes in that is exacerbating the legislation tremendously. Two things, knowledge and time.
Yep.
So the reference to standardization in the AI Act seems wanting to bridge these two dimensions. Time, meaning that anything, so EU legislation usually takes in between what, 5 to 7 years to pass. Having an unflexible sort of a definition of something, of a technology or of the values related to a technology in a draft legislation means that they are outdated by the time that they are enacted or enactable. So this time dimension and the missing expertise on the side of the policymakers forces the legislator to operate with these placeholders. And from my point of view, introducing a huge problem that you highlighted, meaning that from the very beginning, none of the standards are in full compliance with EU values, interests, and principles. Because the normative dimension of the EU regulation in AI very much has a human rights focused, as you said, right? Not a enabling structure for the industry. And there, I'm wondering how legislators could come to the idea that a reference to international standards would be a good idea from the very beginning, given the huge P in private co-creation. So it's said to be public-private, but the P is very minusculo for the private sector in standardization of technology currently, because the knowledge is there. And no legislator, no policymaker has the knowledge to understand what the development and technology brings. So that's the first part. Based on this, meaning that the industry is basically self-regulating. Given that technology advances at a pace that no other expert really can trace, and confidentiality of expertise, of knowledge, is a huge factor in corporate dealings. So not only can't we trace the technology, but we can't even know everything that needs to be known to regulate.
Mhm.
So this imbalance need, in a way, leads to this dysfunctional integration of standards as a reference point that are from the very beginning inadequate because they do not represent the EU's own approach. That's an interesting part, and the question is in an institutional frame how this could be tackled. So the second point, co-creation. So the question usually you would refer to co-creations as public-private partnerships and regulatory mechanisms, but in a way, the problem seems to be with the AI Act that the regulated define what is regulated instead of the regulator. So we have a bit of an inversion of
Mhm.
the framing of laws in a way, where any type of institutional response needs to factor this interest-laden dimension of any co-creation in. So a bit of natural skepticism against what industry brings up, against standards that are private, that are sold even, because you could argue that any legislation that relates to standards must make sure that standards are accessible. You said that, right? That they are not limited by means of economic wealth or by whatever entry point.
Mhm.
That's a really, really problematic part. The table that you showed, from my point of view, manifested that really. If we and I only look at the US and the EU because there seems to be the biggest problem currently happening because US actors dominate the EU market. Yeah. And but that's just a footnote. The Trump administration's behavior in terms of EU reaction on championing EU companies seemed to be stronger than the Brussels effect.
Mhm.
So now the move of EU governments to pay a premium or use EU-made software, EU-made AI, might force US market actors to into more compliance than the EU AI Act, which is interesting. So Trump could be the real Brussels effect for AI application in Europe, which is an interesting element.
Mhm.
So then the next point is um, the question how to impact on standards, how to really impact on standards in ISO, in standardization bodies. Some standards at the very beginning of all of these on wokeness of standards, which were around the, don't know if you remember that EMAS, so the Environmental Management and Audit Scheme, which was one of the first very prominent standards that had an impact on the market. They were temporarily developed after the legislation.
Mhm.
But now it, the time dimension again, we seem to have inverted that so that we are running after standards and trying to design legislation around standards. And the question is, and that's a question to you, if we look into one element or one area rather where standardization has become a prominent institutional question for the Commission in recent years, that's sustainability reporting,
Mhm.
right? So ESG, but also related to the experience of the Global Reporting Initiative around the SDGs. And the EU has designed there or inaugurated a financial reporting advisory group that developed own standards. Could that be a way to move forward to say we acknowledge that the industry standardization is what regulates the industry internally? But we
Mhm.
need to make ourselves a bit more independent to enshrine the normativity that we look for into the standards that we request from market players. They
Mhm.
might be or should be or could be very much in line with the corporate standardization, but would be corporate plus.
Mhm.
So are these institution building bodies within the EU's institutional ecosystem an option to develop something like EU standards that could force or could reinforce a Brussels effect? Or is it more realistic to say Brussels effect, so the market traction and the compliance of corporates who want market players with EU legislation is hollowed out by this reference to international standards in the regulation itself? Sorry to be a bit lengthy, but it was such a fascinating field and it interconnects so many questions of soft law, open method of coordination, standardization, um, in an area that is human rights related,
Mhm.
right? Um, uh, and the overweight of the market actors in ideational framing of the law is so unfettered, it seems. That it's really it's a fascinating research and a lot of scenario building in there. And I like that you stopped with scenarios, so what could be the future, to show also the negative impact of what if we don't emancipate ourselves. But sorry, over to you.
Thank you so much. Fascinating questions like that make me like want to add to the list of questions that I have pending already. So thank you so much. I'm gonna react to a couple of ideas. So for instance, like how legislator could come up with the idea that a reference to standardization is, or to international standardization is a good idea. And I mean, I think here what the EU was trying to semi-comply with the international trade law. So of course the EU cannot set its own European standards disregarding what is going on at international standard level. And yeah, I mean, that's what I call it conditional, because it considers international standards provided that they comply with the EU standards. But like it was the only way they could do it, like for the reasons that you anticipated yourself, like state of the art, is the technical knowledge, is so it's all yeah the pace at which technology develops, all that, the lack of that expertise within the legislators, of course, all that, or those are reasons that amount and put it in the scale towards deciding for a standardization, and the flexibility as well that was also mentioned. But on your second question on confidentiality and such, so all that, so there is two dimensions there. There is a dimension in which there are standard essential patents. So for those who are not familiar with it, it's like where a patent which is protected by intellectual property needs to be disclosed because it's necessary for producing a standard. And there is like this trade-off between, on the one hand, protecting the technology, and on the other, making the technology accessible so that the standard can be created. And then we have other issue also related um, to intellectual property, which is the accessibility. So a standard, it's copyrightable. So a standard is a document that, because it's produced by a private organization, it can be sold, as I just mentioned, and is protected by copyright. The problem arises when the legislation refers to the standard, because that means that it's making reference to legal obligations for which you need to pay for. So here you ask, like, there is this in function, this function you portrayed it, and I liked it a lot, as a dysfunctional integration of standards into the legal system and how it can be solved. So is the case law the one who is like slowly, like Hans Miklitz call it, like breaking the club of standardization, right? Like it's slowly about going through um, the potential safeguards that standardization organizations take from these procedures, and based on the specific safeguard that they take from these procedures, then how they can be slowly, let's say, penetrated, if I may, through interpretations of the case law. So it already started in 2011 to some extent about like what's the legal effect of a standard, and more recently with the accessibility of a harmonized standard. So there is still on the court goes kind of like middle ground. It says like the standard is still copyrightable, but there is a higher interest, that is the accessibility, to actually make that copyrightability like to fall in favor of that accessibility. And that's what the Court of Justice is doing, and it considers that at least harmonized standards are part of EU law, so that means that they can also be interpreted by the Court of Justice of the European Union. And there's been some procedural adjustments being made in terms of like accommodating that case law. Let's see what happens, because there was also like on the table in relation to what I mentioned first, standard essential patterns, there was also a proposal on the table that was withdrew already last year. So we need to see how that's going on. Also, there's been discussions about how to, and this connects with the third question, or the third issue, how to increase civil society participation in standardization, because of the very same reasons that you mentioned. It's costly, etc., etc. Participation, is always closed door discussion, but it's becoming more and more political. So there is no explanation that will justify that these highly normative decisions are made behind closed doors. So that means that increasing civil participation in standardization is one means, but more control and monitoring and changing some of the dynamics is also some of them. The problem, and this is something that I work in another paper, I cannot remember which one, in which I talked about what happens when it's a highly theoretical paper, because I'm talking about how standardization gets legitimized bottom up. And here I use the institutional complementarity theory that probably you're aware of, in which the more an institution, a private rulemaking institution, resembles a public rulemaking institution, the more legitimacy is perceived over them. So that's why international standardization organizations now have their own constitution, their own rules, norms, procedures, voting procedures, etc. But it's not yet enough to actually justify the amount of delegation that has been made to these bodies. And with regard to the third point, in which we were talking about, like, okay, there's been this delegation to international standards, and there is like an overweight of private actors in these fora, etc., etc. It's connected to what I just said before, but there is also this problem that is perhaps gonna be very difficult to get rid of. First, and looking at your background, and then I see knowledge, governance, transformation, right? Like knowledge is the part that justifies here that we are in the situation we are here, because the knowledge is in the industry, is not in the regulator. And the second point is that there is a strong path dependency, because making rules takes time, legal rules takes time. Then the preferred option was not only standards, like we can talk about other type of standards that are best practices, code of conduct, etc., which I consider all to be kind of in the same basket, although with different variations of legitimacy based on the procedural aspects that I just mentioned. And here, my prognosis is that it's going to be very difficult to step out of a path that is already explained by past dependency of what happened already in the past, because since making, as I said, like making the laws takes time, then when you have standards developing in parallel and then standards become dominant, etc., it becomes very difficult to reverse what has been done. Yet, it is possible to revert what has been done, because ultimately it is for the rule, the law, to decide on a standard. So the USB C charger now, there were better alternatives to that, yet the legislator decided that that's going to be the dominant standard, and that's going to be the dominant standard. So we can always rely on the EU saying like, okay, these EU standards are the ones who are going to operate in the EU, and just those, and that will be a way to revert any anti-EU values interference that we may have through standardization. But again, it depends on the political will.
Yeah, yeah, great. And which we see actually this week, right? This week entered into law that we only can use this one charger. Sorry
Mhm.
for the dear tour. What would you say? And what you said on, I'm going back to what you said to about copyrightable standards,
Mhm.
which was fascinating and a bit scary actually, because disclaimer, layperson, no lawyer, layperson, legal understanding, which I know deviates most of the times with law and law perspectives. So, um, what seems to be the current case is that we need to revert to case law to clarify things and to ask for access and to implement and prevent damage from happening. And here's the thing, you said prevent damage from happening. Doesn't their due diligence come in that the legislator actually shouldn't put EU citizens in the situation that they need to go before the courts to request their rights from market actors? Shouldn't we be prevented by legislation from that? So
There's a
in a way, the prevention principle from EU environmental law and
good.
even the precautionary, if a technology can't be assessed, it can't be put on the market, seems to play no role here. And in a way, um, the EU legislator legislates knowingly that they put a legislation in place where EU citizens need judicial support for protecting their rights post damage. Or is that a wrong interpretation?
It's not per se a wrong interpretation, but it is something that I want to be lenient here towards the legislator. It did not anticipate. And not being anticipated, then it all falls back to what happens later with litigation. That's the way I see it, because otherwise it will have fall through at the level of regulatory discussion, parliamentary discussion, etc. Now we see the consequences of it in matters that are related to product safety mostly. But AI is something different. And this is something that the literature has been discussing already for some time already, like how to use a regulatory approach that was intended for products and product safety to something AI, which is not a product. So that's kind of like the main narrative that there is behind the inadequacy of delegating this, as we said already, these heavily normatively laden choices to standard setting. And then we're going to see a lot of litigation for sure in this. That has become the issue. I mean, as a lawyer, perhaps I'm not that worried because perhaps because I'm a private lawyer, so I do trust private law more, and private law is a bit more ex post than it's ante. And we've seen it now with the US rulings on Meta and YouTube about children protection, about like their addictive features of the platforms. And it has been done through civil litigation. And yeah, I mean, it's something that also in terms of remedies, the European Commission may put some fines on Meta or YouTube for not respecting EU law, but who does that money goes to? Does it go to the affected parties? Not always. So, and again, nor the AI Act, neither the DSA are charters of rights. So it does not contain like a specific actionable remedies that you as a citizen can go against. So at least if there is like a flaw in the legislation that allows me to go to the court and obtain some redress, as imperfect as it might be, perhaps it's better than a monitoring situation in which I'm still not safe from suffering a damage, even if the company claims is complying with the legislation, because there are situations in which compliance doesn't mean lack of harm. Yet I could still like obtain some redress. I mean, here I'm sitting myself into the thinking because it's not an easy question, Gabi, I must admit. But yeah, more on the tangible side than these grandiloquent promises and fines that then, yeah, they don't benefit society in tangible terms. Sorry about that.
No, but thank you very much. I have another question which I backload and give the floor to Marvi.
Mhm.
Thank you, Gabi. Hi, Martha.
Hi, Marvi.
It was really fascinating seminar. So I have just been thinking about in my research as well. I'm also writing about technical standards, and I have been thinking about the effects of Brussels effect, especially related to AI. And I was wondering, and then I would like to have your comments or feedback about it. Can we say that, okay, in terms of Brussels effect, the effect starts because of three reasons. So the big EU market, the non-diversification, and also the regulatory capacity of the EU. But when we are speaking about technical standards, particularly in the field of AI, it's more about the effects that are drawing from the SDOs rather than, so basically you are making the same claim, but I'm just trying to link it with the Brussels effect, that
Mhm.
basically the regulatory force or the Brussels effect is not driving from the point when the regulation is coming into force, but much earlier when the standards are being set in the standard setting organizations. And in my research as well, at one point I'm still like trying to incorporate that argument, but so I would like to have your comments or feedback, what you think about it, and can we extend the analysis about Brussels effect to even preceding part that comes before it? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marvi. Great question. Because precisely, I mean, some people tend to think that the Brussels effect comes from EU legislation only. And if you read the 2012 paper that originated the term, it's actually about technical standards mostly. So there is this need to actually go and look at technical standards, and technical standards, they come across different directions, but also in terms of time. Like they come after the regulation because they are enabled by the regulation, but they also come prior to the regulation because precisely there is a lack of regulation. So it's very much not only good but like compulsory to look into what happened before to see where we are coming from. I usually like to tell like to my supervisee students like, okay, where are we, but where are we coming from and where are we going, because that also determines pretty much the explanations of why are we where we are right now. So I think it's very important that to look into what happened before necessarily, and how that impacts kind of in your case your hypothesis about the Brussels effect for sure.
Thank you very much. Um, in view of the time, I just give that question to your reflection room because it's a big
Okay.
question, maybe absurd, but would the change of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights change anything on that? Meaning, to bring some sort of hierarchy in there, how individual rights can be affected by what areas. This is just a rhetorical, bringing it
Mhm.
into your thought process because we're running over time and I
Yeah.
don't want to eat up anybody's afternoon. But this is really an interesting question. As you said, what would be required is, in terms of the hierarchy of rights, a higher level
Mm.
that could exert whatever. And there I'm adding a question to your scenario building, some sort of impact on
Totally.
standardization.
Totally.
So meaning EU to follow standardization or to accept standardization that are in line with EU standards. And but as we discussed, the time dimension is so difficult of ex ante standardization, legislation,
Mm.
technical development, standardization, technical development, and then legislation,
Mm.
that this hierarchy could be blurred. But as it touches upon the second leg of your expertise, the rights and values question, that could be very interesting to understand. Um, so from there, Marvi just said a thank you, and that she drops out. With that, I actually wanted to add to that, Marta. This you're doing an super interesting piece of research at the moment, and with your broader research area, touch upon things that really also disciplinary wise, um, bridge questions of sociology, of political
Mm.
science, law, um, that are contemporarily and every day
Mhm.
relevant for citizens. And we haven't yet gone into Gen AI, but just AI.
Mm.
And I guess the question for for you, but you said that you are writing a research proposal on that currently, quite right, on the area, because that's really something that requires and demands and actually also deserves a broader research and a future-oriented focus that lasts a bit longer than just a presentation of 1.5 hours.
Totally.
Marta, I thank you very much. It was super interesting, really. A bit scary, honestly, but super interesting and scary of the implications of standardizations that come so technical and present numbers as a very neutral thing, which they aren't. And whenever you have something to discuss or want feedback, please let us know. We're more than happy to host you again in the cluster.